I still hear her voice echoing through the house like shattered glass. Pay rent or sleep in the street. My stepmom, Linda, was standing over my grandfather, Arthur, her face twisted with rage. He didn't even look up, just sat there, silent, his trembling hands resting on the same armchair he'd built with Grandma decades ago. I wanted to scream, to tell her to shut up, but Grandpa's calm eyes stopped me. He simply said, "Some lessons don't need words." That night, I lay awake replaying every cruel thing Linda had said, every insult, every sigh, every time she called him a burden. But nothing could have prepared me for what came next, because by sunrise, the movers were already in the driveway. Linda ran outside barefoot, screaming. Grandpa just sipped his coffee and said, "You wanted me to contribute, Linda. Consider this. My final payment." It all started 2 months before that morning, the one that changed everything. When Dad married Linda, I tried to be optimistic. She was charming, always smiling for the neighbors, always dressed like she was heading to a magazine shoot. But when the front door closed, the mask slipped. Her voice turned sharp, her smile faded, and every word she spoke had edges. Grandpa had moved in with us after Grandma died. The house technically belonged to him, but he insisted Dad manage it, for the family's future. That's when Linda's resentment started to show. She liked control. The idea that the roof over her head still had Grandpa's name on it, it burned her. At first, it was little things. She'd forget to make enough dinner for him. She'd leave sticky notes on the fridge. "Milk is expensive. Don't drink too much." Or she'd sigh loudly whenever he turned on the heating, saying, "Guess someone's not worried about our utility bill." Dad pretended not to notice. He'd been doing that for years. Avoiding conflict was his favorite hobby. But I noticed. And Grandpa noticed too. He never complained. He'd sit by the window every morning with his black coffee and the Wall Street Journal, quietly circling numbers in the margins. Sometimes I'd ask, "Grandpa, what are you working on?" He'd smile faintly. "Just keeping my brain sharp, sweetheart." Linda would roll her eyes. "More of his imaginary investments," she'd mutter. "The worst part?" She said it loud enough for him to hear. One afternoon, I came home early from work and caught Linda on the phone with her friend. I swear, he just sits there all day doing nothing. David and I are paying for everything while he freeloads. I told him, if he doesn't start paying rent, I'll call a realtor and list the house myself. My blood ran cold. List the house? The same house Grandpa built with his own hands after coming back from the Navy? I wanted to storm in and tell her the truth, that Grandpa wasn't poor, that he probably had more money in his accounts than she'd ever touch. But Grandpa had warned me once, never argue with someone who measures worth by dollars. They'll never understand value. That night at dinner, Linda brought up the rent issue again, smiling sweetly at Dad, pretending it was just a casual suggestion. "Arthur, you know, it's only fair everyone contributes. Even a small rent would help." Grandpa set down his fork and looked at her. "You're right, Linda. Everyone should contribute." Her grin widened. Then he added softly, "And some of us already have." She didn't understand what he meant. Not yet. But looking back now, that was the moment, the first small crack in the foundation she thought she controlled. The next few weeks felt like walking on glass. Linda's words had become knives wrapped in honey, polite enough in public, poisonous in private. She'd bragged to her friends about how gracious she was for letting Grandpa stay with us, then whisper to Dad at night, thinking I couldn't hear, "David, your father's draining us. He doesn't even try to help. It's time he faces reality." Grandpa heard every word. He never reacted. That's what scared me most. His silence wasn't weakness, it was calculation. Every morning, he'd sit at the kitchen table before sunrise. A single lamp on, newspaper open, pencil in hand. The smell of coffee and ink filled the room. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of the pages, columns of numbers, charts, handwritten notes. "Grandpa," I asked once, "why do you still do this? You're retired. You could relax." He smiled, that soft, knowing smile of his. "Because, sweetheart, quiet work builds loud results." Linda didn't notice any of it. To her, he was just an old man wasting time. She'd walk past him with her cup of oat milk latte and scoff, "Morning, Arthur. Studying your fantasy stocks again?" He'd simply nod. Something like that. She mistook patience for surrender, and that would be her downfall. One Sunday, Grandpa asked me to help him in the attic. Dust floated through the sunlight as we opened a few old boxes. Inside were financial binders, ledgers, and a small lockbox. "What's this?" I asked. He opened it gently. Inside was a collection of property documents, stock certificates, and a thin silver USB drive. "Records," he said. "Proof of preparation." "For what?" He looked at me, his blue eyes calm but sharp. "For when people forget who built the ground they're standing on." That sentence stuck with me for days. Meanwhile, Linda's hostility escalated. She started redecorating, moving Grandpa's chair to the garage, donating his old photos, claiming the living room as her space. When I tried to stop her, she snapped, "Emily, he's had his turn. It's time we modernize." Grandpa didn't protest. He just moved to the porch and spent his evenings watching the sunset, notebook on his lap. One evening, I sat beside him. "You shouldn't let her treat you like this," I said quietly. He chuckled. "Let her? I'm giving her the rope. Whether she ties it or hangs herself with it, that's up to her." I frowned. "What does that mean?" He smiled without answering. That was Grandpa, always a few moves ahead, like a chess master waiting for his opponent to make one final, fatal mistake. At the time, I didn't understand what he was preparing for, but I do now. Because behind that calm exterior, behind every quiet sunrise at the kitchen table, Grandpa wasn't just enduring Linda's disrespect, he was setting the stage for her greatest lesson. The days after that dinner were quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that hums under your skin, warning you that something is coming. Linda had gotten bolder since Grandpa didn't argue back. She took his silence as surrender. She thought she'd won. Every morning, I'd come downstairs and see him sitting in the same spot at the end of the kitchen table, reading the Wall Street Journal with his glasses halfway down his nose, steam rising from his coffee. He'd underline lines, scribble notes, sometimes tap his pen against the edge of the cup. To anyone else, it looked like the routine of an old man passing time. But I knew better. There was a rhythm to it, deliberate, focused, like he was quietly tuning an instrument only he could hear. "Grandpa," I asked one morning, leaning on the counter, "why do you still do all that research? You don't need to work anymore." He smiled, eyes still on the paper. "Working and worrying aren't the same thing, Emily. I stopped one, but never the other." He turned the page and said something that stuck with me. "People think silence means weakness, but silence just means I'm thinking while they're talking." I didn't understand it fully then, not until later, when that silence turned into thunder. Linda, of course, couldn't stand that calmness. She thrived on control, and nothing infuriated her more than someone she couldn't provoke. If Grandpa didn't fight back, she found new ways to poke. One afternoon, she stormed into the kitchen while Grandpa was sitting there, writing in his notebook. "You know what, Arthur? You could at least pretend to be useful," she sneered. "Do something around here instead of sitting like a museum exhibit." He didn't flinch. He just looked up, smiled, and said, "Linda, sometimes doing nothing is the most useful thing a person can do." Then he went right back to writing. Her face turned red, but he didn't give her the satisfaction of anger. It drove her insane. That night, I overheard Linda on the phone again. "He's too stubborn to move out, but if I keep pushing, David will see how much of a burden he is. Once he's gone, the house is ours." She laughed, that fake, breathy laugh she used when she thought she'd outsmarted someone. But the thing is, Grandpa wasn't just sitting idle. He was preparing. One Saturday morning, he called me into his study, a small room lined with old books, maps, and a dusty globe. "Close the door, sweetheart," he said. I did. He opened a drawer and pulled out a black binder filled with neatly labeled documents, bank statements, property deeds, investment records. "I'm showing you this because someday, you might need to understand what's really going on here." I flipped through the pages. Everything was meticulously organized, decades of savings and growth. "Grandpa, you're not broke," I whispered. He chuckled softly. "No, dear, I'm not." "Then why let her talk to you like that?" He closed the binder gently. "Because some lessons have to be seen to be believed." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing his words in my head, trying to decode them. He wasn't planning revenge, not exactly. It felt more like justice. The quiet kind that doesn't shout or break things, but changes everything when it arrives. At breakfast the next day, Linda walked in and said loudly, "Arthur, we're increasing your share of groceries this month. Inflation, you know." Grandpa looked at her for a long moment, smiled faintly, and said, "Don't worry, Linda. I'll contribute in my own way." She smirked, thinking she'd finally gotten through to him. But I saw the look in his eyes, steady, deliberate, unbothered. He wasn't defeated. He was waiting. And I realized something that morning. My grandfather's silence wasn't empty. It was loaded, like the moment before lightning strikes. It was mid-April when everything in the house began to feel charged. The air itself carried static, every word vibrating with the threat of another argument. Linda had turned the place into a spreadsheet. On the refrigerator, she taped a new chart, household contributions. Next to her own neat columns of expenses, she'd written Grandpa's name in red marker. Electric, $90. Groceries, $180. Rent, $800. When Grandpa saw it, he didn't even blink. He pulled out a pen, and beneath her totals, wrote one small sentence. Respect. Priceless. I bit my lip to keep from laughing. Linda, however, went crimson. "Do you think this is funny, Arthur? Because it isn't." He folded the paper once, slipped it into his pocket, and said, "No, Linda, it's just true." After that, she stopped pretending to be polite. Every conversation turned into a test. "Arthur, can you chip in for gas? Arthur, you do know you're living here for free?" Dad would mutter, "Enough," but never enough to stop her. He looked like a man permanently trapped between two storms, his wife and his father. Then, one Thursday night, I overheard the storm she'd been hiding. She was on the phone, pacing the kitchen. "If I can convince David to sell, I'll finally get what's mine. His father doesn't deserve that house anyway, it's wasted on him." I froze halfway up the stairs. Sell the house? The house Grandpa built after Grandma died? The house with his initials carved into the porch beam? I wanted to burst in, to shout the truth that the deed still carried Grandpa's name, but I remembered his words. People reveal themselves eventually. The next morning, Grandpa and I had breakfast alone. He stirred his coffee slowly, watching the cream spiral. "Grandpa," I said quietly, "I think she's trying to sell the house." He didn't look surprised. "She's been trying to own something that was never hers," he said. "It's a common mistake. So, what will you do?" He smiled, but it wasn't the gentle kind. It was thin, deliberate, like a blade sliding back into its sheath. "Nothing yet. The market's about to rise. Timing matters in everything." From that day, the house became a battlefield fought in whispers. Linda strutted through rooms she planned to list. She took photos on her phone, measuring walls, calculating open concept potential. Grandpa, meanwhile, began making calls, quiet ones. I'd hear his low voice through the study door. "Yes, Mark. List it privately. Cash offer preferred. Transfer within 30 days. He never mentioned it to Dad, or to me. But I could feel the gears turning. On Sunday, Linda told Dad at dinner, "If your father doesn't pay by next month, I'm calling a realtor." Grandpa looked up from his plate and said evenly, "Good idea. Maybe I'll save you the trouble." Her fork clattered. "What's that supposed to mean?" He just smiled. "Timing, Linda. Always about timing." That night, I saw him outside on the porch, phone pressed to his ear, moonlight catching the edges of his white hair. I realized then that the quiet old man she'd mocked wasn't waiting for her to apologize. He was waiting for the perfect moment to end the game. It happened on a Sunday evening, the kind of still, golden hour that should have been peaceful. But in our house, peace was a myth. Dinner had barely started when Linda slammed her fork down. "So," she said sharply, eyes fixed on Grandpa, "have you decided yet?" He looked up slowly. "Decided what, Linda?" "About rent, Arthur. Or are we supposed to keep supporting you while you sit there playing Monopoly with your retirement funds?" Dad stiffened, staring at his plate. I could see his jaw tighten, but like always he said nothing. Grandpa dabbed his mouth with a napkin. "I wasn't aware I was a burden," he said evenly. Linda snorted. "Burden? That's generous. Try freeloader. You don't pay for anything: food, power, water, and you've been here for months. Maybe you think your military stories pay the bills?" Her voice was rising, every word sharper, hungrier. She wanted a fight. She wanted him humiliated. Grandpa just sipped his tea. Linda, he said quietly, I built this house for my family, not for arguments. She laughed a bitter, cutting sound. Your family? Don't kid yourself. This house belongs to us now. David and I are the ones keeping it running. You just sit there and act important. Dad's hand clenched around his fork. Linda, enough? He murmured, but she waved him off. No, he needs to hear this. We can't afford to carry dead weight anymore. The silence that followed was suffocating. I felt my heart hammering in my chest. Then Grandpa stood up slowly, deliberately. He looked at her the way a mountain looks at a storm. Patient, immovable, quietly dangerous. I understand, he said simply. Linda blinked. You? What? I understand what you're saying. He set his napkin down, folded it neatly, and placed it beside his plate. Thank you for your honesty. And with that, he left the table. Linda scoffed, rolling her eyes. Finally, maybe he'll start packing. I stared at her, disgust burning in my throat. You have no idea what you've just done, she smirked. Oh please, Emily, don't act dramatic. Maybe this will wake him up. But when I looked toward the hallway, I saw Grandpa pause by the old cabinet where Grandma's photograph Saturday. He touched the frame gently, his fingers lingering for a moment. Then he whispered, barely loud enough for me to hear. Time to clean house. The next morning, I woke to the sound of engines outside. Boxes stacked by the front door. Movers in blue uniforms. A white sign hammered into the lawn, SOLD. Linda came stumbling down the stairs. Hair in rollers. Confusion twisting into rage. What's going on? Grandpa stood by the window, coffee in hand. Calm. Serene. Unbothered. You wanted me to contribute, he said, turning toward her. So I did. What did you do, Arthur? I sold the house. For a heartbeat, nobody spoke. Then Linda's scream shattered the air. You what? He handed her an envelope. You and David have 24 hours to leave. Her voice cracked. You can't do that. Grandpa smiled faintly. I can. And I did. That was the first time I saw fear flicker behind her eyes. Not anger, not pride, fear. Because for the first time, she realized the man she'd treated like a burden was the one holding every card. The sun had barely risen when the shouting started. Linda's voice sliced through the morning like a siren. This isn't happening. This is a joke. But it wasn't a joke. From my window, I saw the mover's truck parked in the driveway. 2 men lifting boxes while Grandpa stood beside them, hands folded neatly behind his back. Calm. Precise. Like he'd planned this moment down to the minute. When I stepped outside, the air smelled like rain and revenge. Grandpa, I whispered. Did you really? He nodded, eyes on the horizon. Paperwork was finalized last night. I've been waiting for the right offer. The house sold at full price. I blinked, stunned. That fast? He smiled faintly. Timing, sweetheart. The market's strong and patience pays. Linda stormed onto the porch, robe fluttering, hair wild. You can't sell this place without my permission. Grandpa raised an eyebrow. My permission was enough. This house belongs to me and David. He held out a manila folder. Read the deed again, Linda. You've been living in my home the whole time. She snatched the folder, flipping through the pages, her face draining of color, as she saw it, Arthur Bennett, sole owner. You, she stammered. You tricked us. He shook his head. No, Linda. You tricked yourself. You assumed things you never verified. For once, she was speechless. Dad came running from the driveway, pale and breathless. Dad, what's going on? Movers? Sold sign? Linda's freaking out. Grandpa handed him a second envelope. This one's for you and Emily. Inside was a cashier's check. $250,000, Grandpa said. Your share from the sale. Enough to start fresh. Dad stared at the check like it was a live grenade. You're giving us this? I'm giving you a clean slate, Grandpa replied quietly. The rest goes where it matters. Linda stepped forward, voice trembling with fury. That's our money! Asterisk, we built this life together! Grandpa turned to her slowly, the faintest smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. You built nothing but resentment, Linda. I built this home. Every beam, Every nail, every memory. You tried to turn it into a ledger. She looked around the living room now half empty, furniture wrapped, echoes replacing warmth. You can't throw family out like this, she snapped. He met her gaze. You stopped being family when you told me to sleep in the street. For a second, no one moved. Even the movers froze mid-step. Linda's voice cracked into a whisper. You can't mean that. Grandpa looked her dead in the eye. I mean every word. And with that, he turned away, walked out to the garden, and sat beneath the old oak tree Grandma had planted decades ago. He didn't yell. He didn't gloat. He just sipped his coffee while Linda's world unraveled behind him. That was the moment I realized something profound. True power doesn't need volume. It's quiet, controlled. And when it moves, it changes everything. Linda thought she'd driven Grandpa out. But that morning, she learned what real eviction looks like, the kind that comes with a signature, not a shout. The air inside the house had changed. Gone was the scent of coffee and old wood polish. It had been replaced by fear, disbelief, and the faint tang of cardboard boxes. Linda was pacing in circles, her voice cracking. You can't do this, Arthur. You can't just sell a house out from under your own family. Grandpa stood near the window, sunlight tracing the lines on his face, making him look almost biblical, calm, patient, devastatingly certain. I didn't sell it from under anyone, he said softly. I sold it because of what's been festering over it. Linda spun toward Dad. David, say something. Stop him. Dad looked lost, like a child caught between two fires. Dad, maybe we can work something out. This doesn't have to be so drastic. Grandpa turned to him with kind eyes. Son, sometimes dignity requires drastic measures. Then Linda lunged. She grabbed the check out of Dad's hand and waved it in Grandpa's face. You think this makes you noble? You ruined us. Where are we supposed to live? Grandpa didn't even blink. Wherever you can afford rent, Linda. You've spent years teaching me about responsibility. Consider this your lesson. Her face went white, then red, then white again. You vindictive old man. He sighed, almost pitying. Vindictive? No, I'm consistent. I told you respect is earned, not demanded. Dad finally snapped. Enough, both of you. We're family. Grandpa's voice was gentle, but it cut like glass. Family is more than blood, David. It's how you treat the people who can't fight back. Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. Linda sank into a chair, trembling. You don't know what it's like, Arthur. You don't understand the pressure, the bills. He cut her off. I understand perfectly. I just don't weaponize it against those who love me. Her voice cracked. I didn't mean it when I said, yes, you did, he said simply. And that's the truth that matters. He took a folded envelope from his pocket and set it on the table in front of her. Inside is a receipt for the last 3 years of property tax, utilities, and insurance, all paid from my accounts. Every dollar you complained about supporting me, I'd already covered it. Linda's mouth fell open. That's impossible. Check the bank statements, he said. You've had access the whole time. She fumbled with her phone, fingers shaking. A few taps later, her face went gray. The records were there. Regular transfers. Silent, unnoticed. All those years, she'd been shaming a man who'd been quietly keeping them afloat. Dad sank onto the couch, hands over his face. Dad, I didn't know. Grandpa's eyes softened. I know, son. That's why I'm not angry with you. Just disappointed that you never asked. Then, he turned to Linda, his tone sharpening again. You wanted control. You thought power came from holding the checkbook. But power doesn't come from money, Linda. It comes from peace. The kind of peace that can't be taken away by threats or rent demands. Tears streamed down her face. Please, don't do this. Don't throw us out. He shook his head. I'm not throwing anyone out. I'm just leaving what's rotten behind. He walked toward the door, his steps slow but steady. At the threshold, he paused and looked back one last time. Some people yell to prove they're strong, he said. Others stay silent and prove it. Then he stepped outside into the morning light. The movers followed, closing the door behind him. Inside, Linda collapsed onto the floor, clutching the check like it could stop the world from falling apart. But it was too late. Because at that moment, Every ounce of control she'd ever imagined, having every illusion of dominance, had been sold right out from under her. The house felt hollow after that. Even with boxes stacked in corners and sunlight streaming through the half-empty windows, it seemed to echo. The sound of Linda's sobbing from the next room drifted in waves, sharp at first, then fading into small, broken hiccups. Dad sat at the kitchen table, shoulders hunched, the check lying untouched in front of him. I'd never seen him look so small. Grandpa poured 2 cups of coffee and slid one toward him. "Drink, you'll think clearer." Dad stared at the mug. I should have stopped her. I should have said something the first time she opened her mouth. Grandpa's voice stayed quiet. "Respect isn't defended with shouting, son. It's lived every day, in the small things, listening, asking, choosing kindness even when it costs you." He turned to me then. "Emily, you saw more than anyone. What did you learn?" I hesitated. "That silence isn't the same as weakness." He smiled. "Good? And? That people will believe what they want, until truth hits them in the face." "Better," he said, eyes glinting. "But remember this one. You can forgive without inviting someone back into your home." Dad rubbed his temples. "Where will you go?" "There's a lake cottage I bought years ago," Grandpa answered. "Small, peaceful, paid in full. I'll take Emily there until you decide what's next." Linda appeared in the doorway, face blotchy and pale. "Arthur, please. I was wrong. I shouldn't have said those things." He looked at her for a long moment. "You said what you believed, Linda. The apology is for your conscience, not for me." She stepped closer, desperate. "You don't have to punish us like this." "I'm not punishing anyone," he said softly. "I'm protecting peace. I worked 40 years to earn it, and I won't surrender it for guilt or convenience." She covered her face and fled upstairs. The rest of the afternoon passed in uneasy quiet. Grandpa made sandwiches, humming an old tune Grandma used to love. It was strange. After everything, he seemed lighter, like the weight of being unappreciated had finally slipped off his shoulders. When evening came, we stepped out to the porch. The sold sign caught the last orange light of the sunset. Dad joined us, eyes red, voice low. "Dad, will we ever fix this?" Grandpa sighed. "Maybe. But first, you both have to live it. Let loss teach you what comfort never could." He rested a hand on my shoulder. "Emily, remember this day. Money buys roofs, not respect. Don't ever confuse the two." I nodded, swallowing hard. Inside, Linda slammed a door. Outside, the crickets began to sing. And for the first time in years, Grandpa smiled, without the shadow of endurance in his eyes. The lake cottage sat at the edge of the world, or, at least, that's how it felt. A single gravel road wound through tall pines before opening to still water, mirror flat, holding the sunset like a secret. Grandpa and I moved there 2 days after the sale closed. The first night, he unpacked nothing but a kettle, 2 mugs, and Grandma's old photo. "The rest can wait," he said. "Peace first, furniture later." The quiet hit differently out there. No slamming doors, no muttered insults through walls, just the rhythmic hush of the lake and the creak of the dock under our feet. Sometimes we'd sit on the porch swing, him with his coffee, me with tea, watching the sky fade into gold. He'd say, "Funny thing about storms, Emily, they always make the air cleaner afterward." I asked once if he regretted selling the house. He shook his head. "Houses are walls and roofs. Dignity's the foundation. Once that cracks, the rest doesn't matter." Every Thursday, Dad called. He sounded tired but lighter, like a man rebuilding from the inside out. He told us Linda was staying with her sister, re-evaluating. Grandpa just murmured, "Good, reflections free, and sometimes it's the only thing people can afford." Months passed quietly. The garden bloomed again, wild roses by the fence, mint near the porch steps. Grandpa taught me how to balance investment portfolios, but more importantly, how to balance patience and pride. On one particularly calm evening, he looked across the water and said, "Respect, Emily, is like a loan. You lend it freely, but if it's never repaid, you stop lending to the same borrower." I smiled. "That sounds like something Grandma would have said." He chuckled. "She said it first. I just lived long enough to prove her right." We sat in silence then, the kind that feels earned, Behind us, the world Linda tried to control had dissolved into a memory. Ahead, the lake stretched open and endless, quiet, patient, untouchable. Grandpa wasn't angry anymore. He didn't need revenge or validation. He'd already won the only battle that mattered. The one where you walk away with your peace intact. And as the sun disappeared behind the trees, I realized, sometimes walking away isn't losing. It's winning without shouting.